Brace yourself for 6 harrowing encounters where humans faced the raw power of bears in the wilderness. From a family's horrifying cabin attack in remote Russia to the desperate Kodiak hunters forced to fight for survival against a charging grizzly, these stories reveal how quickly nature's giants can turn deadly. In this video, we'll dive into 6 chilling stories of bear attacks on humans, revealing moments of terror, survival, and the unforgiving force of the wild. At 2 a.m. on August 29, 2025, the Zverev family slept inside their remote luxury cabin, deep within the Russian wilderness, where dark forests stretched endlessly and silence hung heavy under a starless sky. Mikhail, the father, a strong man who had spent years working tirelessly to provide his wife Larissa and their daughters, Anya and Kira, with a life of both comfort and escape, lay asleep, unaware of the danger already stalking the perimeter. For hours, a massive bear had prowled the edge of the forest, restless and driven to desperation by a summer that had failed to produce the berries and roots that typically sustained it. Starved and weakened, yet compelled by instinct, the grizzly followed faint traces of scent drifting from the cabin's kitchen, aromas of human food, rich and intoxicating against the barren wilderness it had searched in vain. The colossal animal moved with a combination of cumbersome weight and terrifying purpose, its fur ragged and matted, ribs faintly visible beneath the thick hide, jaws working in frustrated hunger as it circled the cabin. Inside, the Zverevs remained unaware while the bear pressed close to the back wall, sniffing at the door and pacing with mounting urgency. Then the tension shattered. The reinforced wood initially resisted, hinges straining and the frame quivering under repeated force. Splintering wood, the screech of bending metal, and a sudden deafening crash followed as the door yielded to the predator, exploding inward and jolting the household awake. Mikhail was the first to react, startled from sleep, his body moving before thought could catch up, propelled by instinct and paternal concern. Larissa, startled and frightened, drew the sheets tightly around herself as Anya whimpered, clutching at her mother in confusion. The next sounds extinguished any lingering doubts. Low, guttural growls vibrating through the floorboards, the scrape of claws across tile. Mikhail caught sight of the hulking shadow in the hallway, the bear's outline filling the narrow passage, breath hot and fetid as it advanced. He attempted to intercept it, driven by love and panic, raising his arms in a desperate instinctive gesture, attempting to block the animal with nothing but his own strength. The bear lunged without hesitation, closing the distance with terrifying speed. Its massive head collided with Mikhail's chest, knocking him backward as the sound of bones straining under its force reverberated through the cabin. Larissa could do nothing but brace and pull Anya closer, shielding her child as the bear dragged Mikhail across the floor, its claws raking through his body. Blood smeared across the wood as the animal tore relentlessly, unstoppable in its violent frenzy. Despite Mikhail's desperate attempts to resist, the sheer size and desperation of the predator rendered his efforts futile. Eventually, his body fell limp, discarded as the bear turned its attention to the others. Larissa pressed Anya against herself, retreating into the living room with ragged breath, instincts focused entirely on protecting her daughter. They crouched behind overturned furniture, shadows offering fragile cover as the bear loomed closer, its nostrils flaring, muzzle streaked with blood. Slowly, the animal advanced, sniffing and circling, its eyes catching faint reflections of light before it struck with sudden force. Claws tore through the couch, splintering the furniture as it cornered them. Larissa positioned herself between Anya and the animal, but the bear's sheer weight crushed them both, claws and jaws inflicting devastating injury. Their cries echoed briefly before being consumed by the chaos, the violence ending as abruptly as it had begun. Kira, the older daughter, had woken earlier that night and quietly walked the dim hallway toward a small storage room in another wing of the cabin, focused only on a glass of water and the chill of the late summer air. She had locked the narrow door behind her, a simple act of caution that ultimately separated her fate from the rest of her family. When the first crash reverberated through the cabin, she froze, pressed against the corner, trembling as the chaos unfolded. Growls intensified, accompanied by screams and the tearing of wood and flesh, all echoing through the walls. She remained hidden, clutching her knees, her heartbeat hammering as if each beat might betray her position. The bear continued its rampage for what felt like hours, pacing through rooms, overturning furniture, smashing cabinets, and devouring scraps from the kitchen, leaving destruction and blood in its wake. Eventually, sated by both human flesh and the cabin's provisions, it lumbered back into the night, leaving behind an eerie silence broken only by the soft sobs of a child too terrified to move. Hours passed before hunters from a nearby settlement arrived, drawn by reports of unusual noises and the absence of signals from the family. They discovered the cabin in ruin, the door shattered, the rooms torn apart, and the bodies of Mikhail, Larissa, and Anya lifeless where they had fallen, faces frozen in the last moments of terror. Kira emerged only when voices reached her, legs weak and face pale, her eyes hollowed by the trauma she had survived. Authorities later explained that the attack reflected a growing problem in the region. Shrinking berry harvests left grizzlies bold and desperate enough to venture into human settlements, turning even remote cabins into potential death traps. The Zverev family had sought solitude for peace, yet in that silence, danger had crept closer than they could have imagined. Only one child remained to carry the memory of the night the wilderness broke into their home, the night that demonstrated the fine line between seclusion and vulnerability, where isolation offered neither immunity nor protection from the raw force of nature. On October 10, 2024, the vast forests of Kodiak Island were heavy with the damp smell of moss and salt carried inland by the cold winds of early autumn. Ethan Walker and Marcus Hale had spent hours tracking and finally bringing down a large bull elk, its antlers wide and glistening with dew, its immense bulk a prize earned through patient effort and skill. The men worked beside a slow-moving stream, water tumbling over rounded stones, their breath forming clouds in the chilled air as they began to skin the animal, racing against the approaching dusk. For Ethan, a weight of accomplishment pressed against his chest. The hours of careful tracking had finally yielded success. Marcus knelt nearby, knife sliding through hide and sinew, attention narrowed entirely to the task at hand. The soft hum of the stream and the distant calls of crows filled the air, yet neither man noticed the subtle rustle far above on the ridge, nor the shift in the forest's atmosphere, as if the quiet had thickened into something heavier, waiting for an abrupt break. The scent of blood rose sharp and metallic, carried with each gust to where a massive Kodiak bear prowled the ridge. Its nose twitched with hunger sharpened by recent scarcity. Streams had yielded few salmon, and the rotting berries among the undergrowth offered little sustenance. Yet here was something fresh, something alive with scent and promise, stirring the predator into a restless, deliberate pace. Its paws crushed moss and fallen leaves, weaving a dark, moving shadow through the underbrush. A low growl vibrated faintly between the trunks as it began descending toward the clearing. The hunters, heads bowed, oblivious to the shift, continued their work. Only the sudden snap of branches shattered the calm, and the forest seemed to explode in motion. Ethan's head shot upward first. His eyes widened as a dark blur hurtled downhill, the earth trembling beneath the force of the charge, undergrowth parting as though the trees themselves were retreating. He dropped his knife, lunging for the rifle propped against his pack, fingers fumbling in panic as the bear's thunderous growl filled the clearing. Marcus froze where he crouched, breath caught, knife trembling in his grip, instincts failing as the animal burst fully into view, eyes fixed, mouth glistening with saliva under the dimming sky. The collision came in seconds. The Kodiak's massive body slammed into their gear, sending backpacks tumbling into the stream, knives spinning across stones, and the elk's carcass rolling half-splayed into the dirt. Blood spattered across boots and bark alike. Marcus raised his knife with trembling arms, mind blank with terror even as his body moved on reflex. He thrust the blade forward, futile against the unstoppable mass bearing down. The bear's paw struck with brutal force, tearing through fabric and muscle, carving deep gashes across his chest. The impact hurled him backward, his body skidding over leaves and debris, knife lost, chest heaving, hands pressing desperately against wounds too deep to staunch. Ethan slammed the rifle stock against his shoulder, hands shaking violently, nearly dropping the weapon. Fear and adrenaline blurred his vision, yet the drive to survive overpowered everything else. He squeezed the trigger. The shot cracked sharply, echoing through the clearing, muzzle flash illuminating the forest for a brief instant. The bullet struck the ground near the bear's feet. It jerked, momentarily startled, but did not retreat. Momentum dragged it forward. Eyes alive with both hunger and fury, it shifted focus to Ethan, closing the gap with deliberate, terrifying speed. He fired again, the second shot thundering through the trees. Recoil bruised his shoulder as the bullet struck branches beside the bear's head, startling it. For the first time, the charge faltered. Claws dug into the earth as the animal reared, its massive frame towering above the clearing, breath steaming in the cold air, its roar shaking surrounding trunks and stones. 10 tense seconds stretched across the forest. Predator circling, hunter backing away, Marcus's blood darkening the ground, the elk's body forgotten beneath the raw imperative of survival. Ethan's finger tightened on the trigger, eyes locked, heart hammering, while the bear's growl vibrated through his bones, the standoff taut as if the air itself might snap. The smell of blood, sweat, and autumn leaves mingled in the air, each inhalation a sharp reminder of the fragile line between life and death. Sunlight faded beneath the canopy, shadows stretching like dark fingers over the scene, giving the bear an almost spectral presence. Finally, with a guttural snarl, the bear turned. Hunger for the elk overtaken by the crack of gunfire and recognition of an unseen threat, it lumbered back up the ridge. Massive body tore through underbrush before fading into shadows, growls slowly vanishing. Silence returned, broken only by Marcus's pained gasps and the frantic motion of Ethan's hands against wounds that refused to slow. The forest seemed to exhale, the stream murmured softly, and the cold wind carried the lingering scent of iron through the trees. Fallen leaves drifted around the clearing, spinning slowly to the ground, and the only sound was the faint splash of water over stone, a gentle cadence contrasting sharply with the chaos that had erupted just moments before. Rangers later examined the site, noting how the bear had been drawn by the unavoidable scent of fresh kill, and how commonly predators approached hunters working over carcasses on Kodiak. They emphasized how quickly the line between hunter and hunted could vanish, and how survival in such remote terrain depended on constant awareness, even for experienced men. Ethan and Marcus had understood the risks, yet no amount of experience could lessen the shock of raw power erupting without warning. Both men left the clearing bloodied, shaken, carrying scars that would never fade, a stark reminder of how fragile even the most skilled hunters could become when the wilderness chose to strike back. Even as days passed, the memory of the growl, the smell of blood, and the sheer magnitude of the animal lingered, shaping their sense of caution and respect for the forest's unpredictable force. It was September 23, 2023, and the remote highways of Montana stretched long and empty, flanked by dense forests that rolled into distant mountains. The crisp chill of early autumn carried the faint scent of pine, drifting in through the silent dark like a quiet warning. Caleb Harper, a long-haul truck driver used to navigating rugged routes, had pulled his rig to the roadside where a small market operated on weekends, its stall set to open the next morning for hunters, anglers, and passing travelers. His cargo consisted of crates of fresh salmon packed in ice, their weight shifting slightly as he lowered the ramp. Breath forming clouds in the cool night air, Caleb's mind focused on finishing the delivery and resting before the long drive ahead. The night seemed calm, almost deceptively so, yet unseen among the trees, a massive grizzly had already caught the scent carried on the wind, the sharp, unmistakable tang of fish cutting through the forest and igniting hunger deep within its gut. The bear had spent days foraging along riverbeds where salmon once leapt, only to find the runs weak and unreliable that year. Leaner than it should have been, restless and driven by need, it moved with patient determination toward the source of the smell. Paws crushed moss and fallen leaves under the massive weight, shadows shifting as its hulking body crept closer, blending with the darkened trees. Its nostrils flared, eyes fixed on the faint glimmer of silver through the open doors of the truck. Caleb, unaware of the predator waiting in the shadows, pulled at a heavy crate, muscles straining, mind already consumed with the task at hand. The lid slipped, releasing the scent of raw fish into the night with an almost magnetic force. A soft scraping sound across gravel went unnoticed until the forest seemed to erupt in a single, violent motion. The grizzly lunged with explosive power, massive paw striking the side of the truck with a metallic crack that reverberated along the empty highway. The metal frame shuddered, crates rattling under the impact, and Caleb spun, jolted by shock and disbelief. Stumbling backward, he barely managed to avoid falling over the scattered crates. The bear's growl rolled through the valley like distant thunder, low, resonant, and full of lethal intent. One crate tipped, spilling silver salmon across the asphalt. The smell overwhelmed the night air, intoxicating in its intensity, and the predator dropped low, jaws snapping, saliva thick, pawing at the scattered fish with relentless focus before turning its attention to Caleb, whose scramble toward the cab had already begun. Boots slipped on the slick bodies of salmon beneath him as he lunged forward, arms pumping, breath searing his lungs with every ragged inhalation. Another swipe of the bear's paw tore through his arm and shoulder, shredding cloth and cutting deep into flesh. Pain ripped a cry from his chest. Blood quickly soaked through his shirt, and muscles screamed as he forced himself onward, one hand clutching the wound while the other clawed at the cab door handle. Behind him, the bear's roar rolled across the clearing again, shaking the ground beneath its immense weight, mixing with the sharp metallic tang of blood and the unmistakable smell of fish, driving its hunger even fiercer. Caleb's hand fumbled into the side compartment and found the emergency kit. Fingers clutched around the cold metal cylinder of a road flare, a tool that might offer a fleeting chance of survival. Ragged breaths and trembling limbs carried him forward as he struck the cap, sparks erupting into the night before the crimson flame burst to life. Light and heat tore through the darkness, smoke curling upward, hissing with an almost unnatural intensity. Caleb swung it high, arcs of fire cutting through the blackness, each movement deliberate despite the blood dripping from his arm. Determination overrode exhaustion and pain, every motion a desperate command to the bear to halt. The bear faltered, confusion momentarily overtaking instinct. Its growl softened into a hiss of irritation, eyes narrowing against the sudden blaze, each strand of smoke curling through its nostrils and making the air burn. The glow painted the asphalt red, shimmering across the spilled salmon. Caleb advanced a cautious step, flare raised, body trembling but arms steady, swinging arcs of fire wide. The predator grunted, weaving its massive head from side to side, paws scraping the ground as it measured the threat, before slowly, reluctantly inching back toward the tree line, one enormous step at a time. Time stretched, each heartbeat pounding in Caleb's chest, every second drawn taut as if the night itself held its breath. The flare's flame dwindled, but the resolve in his stance remained unbroken. Finally, with a frustrated roar that echoed through the forest and mountains beyond, the grizzly retreated. Its massive body disappeared into the shadows from which it had emerged, leaving only the lingering mix of smoke, blood, and fish to mark the scene. Caleb sank against the truck, knees weak, wound burning sharply, eyes locked on the tree line even as a fragile silence returned. By morning, authorities arrived, alerted by Caleb's report after he had summoned help once able. The site was examined, littered with fish, blood, and deep claw marks gouged into the truck's metal frame. Rangers noted the unavoidable draw of the fresh kill, how even skilled hunters could become prey in moments when instinct and hunger collided in the wilderness. Caleb had survived, but the lacerations ran deep, scars permanent reminders of how quickly routine could unravel into a battle for life. The empty highways of Montana, deceptively quiet, were never truly safe. In the shadows, hunger always watched, always waited, a silent force ready to strike without warning. The river curved gently through the quiet woods of northern Vermont, its surface glistening beneath the pale sunlight of September 12, 2021. The water moved in soft currents, whispering against stones worn smooth by years of flow. Above, a canopy of early autumn leaves stretched across the sky, streaked with the first hints of orange and red, while the forest beyond held a dense, almost oppressive silence, a mix of beauty and unspoken tension. Daniel Price, 38, and his girlfriend Sophie Turner, 35, had chosen this secluded bend for its calm. Here they could paddle their kayak to the bank, cast their lines, and fish in solitude, far from the noise of towns and roads. Their movements were slow, deliberate, laughter-light, and for a time it seemed the fragile peace of the bend would remain undisturbed. Yet the forest was not empty. That year's nut harvest had failed, leaving black bears restless, hungrier than usual, pushing them closer to human activity than most locals preferred. The scent of fish carried easily on the thinning air, sharp and metallic, drifting like a signal into the dense trees. Daniel crouched on the bank, knife in hand, cleaning a freshly caught trout. The silver body flashed in brief glimmers before his practiced movements sent blood into the shallow water. Sophie sat nearby, eyes following the gentle curve of her fishing line, unaware that the splashing and scent of blood had reached a predator hiding just beyond the tree line. The bear emerged suddenly, its black form moving with alarming speed through ferns and underbrush. Its head lifted, nostrils flaring, eyes locking on the source of scent with deadly focus. Sophie froze, tension coiling through her body, while Daniel jerked upright, catching sight of the massive figure advancing toward them. Instinct propelled him forward, attempting to shield, protect, and warn. His knife felt small in his hands, pitiful against the weight of muscle and claws moving with terrifying intent. In mere seconds, The distance between human and animal closed. The bear's low growl rolled across the river bend, its hunger sharpened by weeks without sufficient food. The first strike hit with crushing force. Its paw slashed across Daniel's arm, tearing through flesh and muscle, knocking him backward onto the dirt. Blood pooled immediately, shock stealing his breath even as he struggled to rise. The bear's relentless strength pressed him down, jaws snapping, its body dragging him violently toward the underbrush. Sophie's instincts overrode fear. She stumbled forward, searching for anything to repel the predator. Her hands shook, grasping at a fallen fishing rod, throwing it toward the animal in desperation, every motion fueled by terror and determination, though she knew instinct and sheer size favored the bear. The predator's focus remained unbroken. Its claws raked through Daniel's side, jaws clamping down with a force that silenced any sound save for strangled gasps. Sophie pressed closer, hands trembling, searching for stones, sticks, anything that might halt the nightmare unfolding. The scene grew frantic, movements wild, every moment stretching into eternity. Yet the bear's intent never wavered, its hunger consuming each strike and echoing sound, dominating the still woods. Further along the river, campers heard the screams. Sharp, cutting, they pierced the serene forest in ways that made hearts pound and legs move with speed they had not known. Boots thudded against the ground as they approached, rifles raised, voices calling warnings into the trees. Shots rang into the air, the cracking sound scattering birds and echoing off the riverbanks. But by the time they reached the clearing, the bear had already left its mark. It retreated at last, fading into the dense forest, its final growl swallowed by shadow and foliage, as if it had never been there at all. Sophie remained frozen, shock locking her body as her eyes fixated on where Daniel had fallen, torn and bloodied among the leaves. His struggle had ended in minutes, though it felt like hours, each heartbeat stretching the agony. Her chest heaved with sobs caught in her throat, knees trembling until they gave way, hands clutching at the earth as she tried to crawl toward him, drained of strength by the horror she had witnessed. Campers surrounded her, their words steady and calm, yet her mind absorbed none of it. Every sound, every motion blurred into the echo of claws striking flesh, the terror of a fight that had no pause. Authorities later examined the scene, voices measured as they explained how the failed harvest had pushed bears into spaces humans occupied, how the smell of fish could draw them with certainty, and how even the most remote areas carried risk when hunger ruled the wild. Facts were clear, clinical, warnings repeated in tones meant to prevent future tragedies. Yet for Sophie, these words could never contain the image of the river bend, the blood mingling with water, or the silence that followed the predator's departure. The knowledge of danger existed alongside memory, a constant shadow over what once had felt like peace. The river continued to flow, carrying the faint traces of the day into the distance. Sunlight glinted off its surface, brushing over stones and currents as if nothing had disturbed them. Yet the forest had changed. Branches swayed, holding the memory of violence in their stillness, an invisible scar etched into the quiet landscape. For Sophie, the bend that had once brought calm now served as a reminder of loss and survival, a place where time had seemed to stop. Though the river ran on, its waters glinting like silver in sunlight, the wilderness had left a permanent mark. A day of fishing transformed into a confrontation with raw, unyielding force, a lesson she would never forget. The high summer air over the Montana backcountry had grown still as the group of 5 campers settled into their valley site on August 5th, 2025. The location was a wide grassy opening not far from a dense tree line, heavy with the scent of ripening berries, the air warm but carrying the crisp tang of approaching night. Though the group laughed and shared food around their fire on the first evening, none could have guessed that their choice of site placed them directly in the path of one of the hungriest and most dangerous predators the wilderness could offer. Their tents were pitched in a neat half-circle, coolers and supplies stacked carefully nearby, and the sound of the river beyond the rise drifted on the night breeze, giving the place an almost peaceful charm that belied what waited in the shadows beyond. As darkness fell and the flames of the fire sank into glowing embers, the campers drifted into sleep, unaware that a massive grizzly, lean from hunger and desperate for sustenance, had moved silently through the tree line. Its senses had been triggered both by the scent of the berry patch and the human food the campers had brought with them. The bear circled with deliberate patience before finally pushing forward, silent but unrelenting, its hulking frame slipping from shadow into moonlight as it closed the distance to the tents. The first moment of alarm came when Ryan Keller stirred inside his sleeping bag, triggering the predator. In an instant, claws tore into canvas and nylon, shredding a tent wall with ease, dragging Ryan across the ground. His scream shattered the night, high-pitched and frantic, as the bear pinned him with immense strength, raking his shoulder and arm with claws that cut deep, blood soaking his clothes, while the rest of the camp erupted into chaos. Shouts rose as the others scrambled from their tents, flashlights shaking wildly in frantic hands. The sudden noise and movement startled the bear long enough for it to withdraw, leaving Ryan bleeding but alive as it slipped back into darkness. The campers pulled him free, pressing cloth to his wounds, forcing themselves to think through terror and resolved to remain at the site despite the risk. They moved the tents farther from the tree line, secured the food more carefully, and kept a fire burning with the belief that these small measures might deter the predator. Still, each shadow beyond the clearing felt heavier, each whisper of wind through the valley a warning. But the wilderness does not yield easily, and hunger is not turned away by human determination. On the second night, the air carried a sharper chill, and though the campers took turns sitting watch, exhaustion dulled their focus. The Grizzly returned with a bolder, heavier presence, its body moving directly toward the site without hesitation or caution. Ignoring the berry patch entirely, it barreled into the camp itself, muscles coiling and surging as it struck the first tent it found, tearing the fabric with violent swipes and collapsing it over the occupant. Sarah Mitchell felt the world crush around her as claws ripped through nylon, slashing across her side and leg. She cried out into the darkness, a sound mingling fear and pain, while Ryan, though still injured, shouted and tried to help. Others fumbled for flares and fire, sparks bursting into flame and smoke, flickering light illuminating the valley in sudden bursts against the shadowed trees. The bear roared in frustration, a deep resonant sound that rolled across the trees and cliffs, before finally retreating once more. The heat, light, and sudden movement had pushed it back temporarily. The campers gathered around Sarah, lifting her from the wreckage of the tent and tending to her wounds as best they could. Their hearts pounded, each breath sharp with adrenaline, as the realization set in that this was no random encounter. They were facing a determined predator, willing to return again and again until either it was stopped or they were destroyed. Sleep did not come that night, every sound in the woods carrying a threat, every gust of wind reminding them how close they had come to disaster. The night stretched, silent except for distant cries of birds, the whisper of wind through leaves, and the subtle rustle of forest life. Each camper remained alert, eyes scanning the shadows, listening for the telltale snap of branches or the low growl that had haunted them the previous evening. The fire glowed dimly, embers drifting upward, its warmth a fragile barrier against the cold weight of wilderness pressing in. Each movement in the darkness seemed magnified, each distant sound echoing through the valley, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. By dawn, exhaustion had etched itself into every face. When rangers later tracked the bear, they found signs of starvation. A massive male, worn thin by a harsh season, muscles stripped by hunger and activity. Though it had retreated deeper into the wilderness after being driven off, its presence served as a stark reminder of the raw, unyielding forces that ruled the backcountry. Even seasoned humans were no match for desperation driven by survival instincts, the bear's hunger overriding caution in a way that few could anticipate. For the 5 campers, the experience left a lasting imprint. The terror of tearing claws and deafening roars lingered in their memories, woven into every recollection of the valley, the tree line, and the fires they had struggled to maintain. They understood that survival had been a precarious balance of chance, quick thinking, and sheer resilience. Even when the campfire burned down to embers and the berry patch swayed quietly again in the breeze, the memory of those nights remained, etched into their consciousness like a scar. Every rustle of leaves, every whisper of wind in Montana's remote valleys carried the echo of that encounter, a warning that in places where wild hunger reigns unchecked, every campfire, every tent, and every human heartbeat is only a fragile light against the immense weight of the wilderness. The valley remained empty in the days that followed, the 5 campers retreating to safer ground, their gear packed and their steps quick against the weight of memory. Yet the forest around them continued in its indifferent rhythm, streams murmuring softly, wind passing over grass and stone, as if nothing had occurred. The lessons endured, however, as human fragility was laid bare in the face of raw nature. In the backcountry, respect for the forest, its predators, and the unpredictable force of hunger was not merely wisdom, it was survival. On July 18, 2024, the thin light of dawn spread slowly across the remote Carpathian mountains of Romania, casting a pale glow over the valleys where the last mist clung stubbornly to the trees. The air was sharp with the cool bite of high mountain summer, carrying the earthy scent of damp grass and the faint tang of distant pines. In the high meadows above the tree line, Bogdan Ionescu, 47, stirred from his thin blanket near the fire he had kept alive through the night. He rose early, as he had every day since boyhood, for the work of a shepherd left no room for rest when sheep and goats needed constant guarding. The smoke from his small morning fire drifted lazily into the crisp air, mixing with the scent of grazing animals, but the usual morning calm felt different this day. Unnervingly quiet, a tension threading through the stillness. Through the shifting mist, movement caught Bogdan's eye. A dark, heavy shape pressed against a weakened section of the old wooden fence marking the edge of his grazing ground. With a splintering crack, the fence gave way as a massive European brown bear forced its way into the enclosure, drawn by the smell of the livestock and the hunger that had driven it down from the higher slopes. Its coarse fur glistened with morning dew, broad shoulders rippling beneath the thick hide, and its breath came in visible puffs in the cool air. As it stepped forward, sheep and goats scattered in panic, their hooves striking the earth like frantic drums, while the predator's eyes fixed on the weakest of the flock with unrelenting focus. Bogdan grabbed the sturdy staff leaning against a nearby rock, instincts honed over decades of guarding flocks in a land filled with wolves, lynx, and occasionally bears. He ran toward the chaos, shouting bursts of sound into the morning air, but the bear did not retreat. It lifted its massive head, lips curling to reveal sharp teeth, and for a heartbeat Bogdan knew that the predator recognized the ineffectiveness of a lone man armed only with wood. He swung his staff, striking rocks and dirt in an effort to create noise and presence, yet the bear surged forward with terrifying speed, its claws slashed in a brutal arc, tearing into his thigh and sending him staggering backward into the trampled grass, blood seeping quickly through his trousers. The world narrowed to a blur of dust, fur, and sound. Bogdan struggled to rise, each attempt igniting sharp pain through his leg, while the bear lowered its massive head and seized a bleeding goat in its jaws, shaking it violently until bone cracked, the sound echoing through the valley. He forced himself to his knees, gathering rocks from the earth to hurl at the predator, each stone thrown with desperation and the instinctual drive of a man whose life depended on the safety of his flock. The bear grunted, annoyed, and dropped the goat, turning its attention toward Bogdan once more, its massive paws crushing the grass with deliberate steps. He jabbed the staff into the air, his breathing ragged, trying to hold a barrier between himself and the advancing predator. The bear paused briefly, distracted by the scattering flock darting behind him. It lunged sideways, tearing into another goat with savage precision, blood spraying across stones and earth. Bogdan staggered forward, striking the bear's back with a half-split staff, the impact landing solidly but barely slowing the weight of muscle beneath the thick fur. The animal spun violently, claws grazing his shoulder and forcing him into the dirt, breath knocked from his lungs, his heart hammering in the cold air as awareness of mortality sharpened every sense. Minutes stretched endlessly, each moment a battle between survival and overwhelming force. The predator alternated between the fleeing goats and the wounded shepherd, every movement a reminder of nature's raw power. Bogdan's staff cracked under the strain of a desperate swing as the bear charged past him, yet he seized another rock and hurled it directly at its head. The sharp impact stunned the animal long enough to halt its momentum. Panting and bleeding, Bogdan dragged himself toward the glowing embers of his morning fire, grabbing a half-burnt branch and waving it furiously, sparks flying in arcs through the mist. Smoke rose toward the predator, carrying the scent and visual threat of fire. With a low, questioning growl, the bear hesitated, then slowly retreated, each massive step taking it closer to the line of dark pines until it disappeared into shadow. Silence returned to the meadow, broken only by the frightened bleats of the animals and the crackling of the fire. Bogdan collapsed against the earth, blood dripping into the grass, his body torn but his spirit unbroken. Several goats lay dead, others had vanished into the trees. His sheep huddled at the far edge of the clearing, trembling and restless, their instinctive fear thick in the air. Bogdan's leg throbbed with every heartbeat, his shoulder burned from the claw rakes, yet he remained upright, knowing that tending to the wounded and gathering the survivors came first, for a shepherd's duty never ceased, even in the shadow of death. By the time villagers arrived later that morning, drawn by the distant sounds of panic and rumors of another bear descending from the mountains, they found Bogdan bloodied and exhausted but alive, leaning against the staff he had managed to repair with rope and splinters. His animals huddled behind him, shaken but alive. The broken fence, trampled earth, and scattered debris stood as a stark testament to the fragile boundary between wild and tame. In those Carpathian valleys where forests pressed close to meadows and food grew scarce for predators displaced from higher slopes, a shepherd's life remained uncertain. The morning of July 18, 2024, would remain a lasting reminder that survival in the mountains was never guaranteed, only borrowed for as long as nature allowed, earned in moments of courage and desperation under the vigilant eye of the wilderness.